Hey guys, does this work? Does it flip? I guess not. I guess I'm stuck with this. So I'm out here doing Instagram Live one more time because it's the one-day strike at Amazon and other places, and I know that there is no ethical consumption under capitalism, which is a banal and true fact. I don't. Hi, Alana. Hi, John. I do not let anybody. By the way, if you know me and you want to come on, just pop on, give me a request, and I'll say hi. If you don't, though, I mean, I need a little bit more. I think I need a little bit more degree of comfort with you before I make that move. At least while I'm trying to formalize this stuff. Anyway, so there is no ethical consumption under capitalism. It's fine to do whatever you think you need to do. But for me, given my degree of, I do not have any need to be streaming on on Amazon right now, so I'm not going to. And I feel like if that's the attitude you should take. Like, every time there's a strike, especially for companies like this that are about convenience, there's someone who gets really mad and says, well, what if you need, and they create these imaginary situations where someone would need to use the service. And it's like, well, then they should use it. But you're not in that situation. You need to know what your own situation is. How much do you depend on this thing? How much would it cost you not to utilize it when other people who are of good faith are doing something that you agree with? And so if they tell me that, I'm going to just do it. You don't have to. No one else has to. But to me, that is how I align my greater belief in the rightness of the strikers' cause with my life. I would feel if I was on, I could be doing this on Instagram, I could be doing this on Twitch right now, and I would feel nothing but a very little bit of guilt, but it would still be a little bit of guilt that I would have to deal with instead of trying to figure out the world. Like, instead of applying my mind to what's in front of me the way I've been doing now for the last almost week, part of my mind would be distracted by the nagging guilt that I was on Twitch. Now I can stream to you guys directly, don't feel guilty, and also by thinking about that and thinking about my relationship to Twitch and my relationship to boycotts in general, I understand my own motivations even better than I did. So the whole thing, for me, good. And hopefully it'll have an impact. I am less certain of, but I certainly fucking hope that we can get together some degree of social coordination to counteract the terrifying accumulated capital of guys like Bezos. It's like, yikes. It's very scary stuff. And anyone who wants to fight them, and I know we're on Twitch, and that's an even smaller hypocrisy that I deal with. That one I think I can justify, just out of it's a good way to get out to people an idea that they might find useful. And that I can justify. But considering that there are other options available and people have specifically said don't access this site on this day, I'm just going to do it. Like I said, if you make a different conclusion, it's because you have different material circumstances to deal with. And so I'm not going to claim to know you. That is why you can be totally judgmental of other people's actions, but not judge them for them if you're aware that they were all brought about by conditions outside of every individual's control. But that when you're in that superposition of being aware of that, then you have to choose. So how are you guys doing? Unless I got a really tasty question, I'll be back on Twitch tomorrow. Well, see, how do we counteract businesses like Walmart shutting down stores to avoid unionizing drafts? See, that's what suggests that in a retail service economy like the one we have, we actually have to bring together the boycott and the strike to bring together the power of the consumer and the worker. Because in a way that wasn't the case under large scale and isn't the case under large scale manufacturing, the customer truly is the consumer. I mean, the worker truly is the consumer in the retail context. So, like, as a consumer, you have a relationship to Walmart that is more akin to a worker than manager. And so the key to effective action against mega corporations like Amazon and Walmart is not consumer boycott, and it's not individual. It could start with, but it can't be sufficient to do individual strikes within individual areas, because as you see, they can just shut them down. You need a coordination inside and outside between customers and employees, a revoking labor in the form of a strike, and then revoking patronage in the form of a boycott. Then they go together. That's the only way to actually punish them. That's the only way to stop them from closing a Walmart, is if it will have repercussions outside of that Walmart. And that's only if people respond with their role as a consumer. They have a role as a consumer if the degree to which it's coordinated with the work of the labor of the workers. Like, boycotts get rightfully poo-pooed by a lot of people because they are imagined to happen in isolation. And in isolation, boycotts don't work. I just said that as you typed it. Boycotts don't work in isolation. But as we're seeing in a post-industrial landscape, strikes, they work better than boycotts, but they aren't 100% effective. And that a strike could be made more effective if it was in conjunction with a boycott in the context of retail, like big box stores and stuff like that. But once again, it's not an on-off switch. It's not a works good enough to fix it or it doesn't work at all and is a failure. It will work to a degree, and then other things happen, and then you gather up the reactions to those new material conditions and you move from there. And maybe it's no longer a boycott and strike. Maybe it's something else. But you move on depending on your recognition of the changed material circumstances. Happy May Day, by the way. I'm sure most of you know the story of the Haymarket bombing, the Haymarket martyrs, Albert Parsons, August Spies, those brave martyrs, the bomb thrown at the Haymarket rally, the dead cops shooting in the crowd, the frenzied Red Scare, the crackdown on the city of Chicago ever since, the ginned up trial, which led to the unjust executions of what, I believe it's 7 Haymarket martyrs. One of them, though, the bomb maker, yeah, I'm already off. One of them, Louis Ling, the German bomb maker, he was scheduled to be executed, but he had I want to look this up so I have the correct quote. It's an amazing quote. He had smuggled into his cell by one of his visitors a blasting cap in his mouth, and he bit down on it and essentially blew his face off. Pretty gruesome, botched execution, similar to Wolfe Tone, the famous Irish Republican revolutionary who similarly botched cutting his own neck. Also Robespierre botched shooting himself, blasted his jaw off. Anyway, Louis Ling, as he lay dying on the floor of his cell, wrote in his own blood, while his face was blown up, he wrote, "Hooray for anarchy," in his own blood on the floor of his cell after blowing his face off. That's pretty. Hooray for anarchy. Hoch die Anarchie in German. Don't get used to the IG. If the strike is off tomorrow, I'll be back on Twitch. But as long as the employees are calling a strike, I'll be not on Twitch. So yeah, the Haymarket martyrs, who led to the creation of May Day, they were all anarchists, and they were all believers in one degree or another to the to the notion of the propaganda of the deed, and to industrial syndicalism, which were the chief practices of anarchism. Basically assassinating people and trying to organize workers into revolutionary unions, not ones interested in things like floor conditions and shit. But that was the incident that led to May Day becoming the International Labor Day. That was not the. It was the inciting incident for making it into a international day to honor labor, and it was used as a way to agitate towards socialist ends. Of course, that's why we created Labor Day as a depoliticized, Americanized day where we can study labor not as a process of exploitation, or we can celebrate labor not in the context of it being, an unjust exploitation of someone's species being, which is what it was under May Day. Now, hey, you got a job. It's a way to celebrate. And they changed May Day to Law Day during the Red Scare. But guess what? It's still there. You could still call it May Day. You can still, I'm sure the anarchists in Seattle who like to go crazy around this time are not happy with their inability to do it. Maybe they're going to kick out their own front windows. I don't know, while they're under quarantine. But this is actually a good segue to something I wanted to talk about, referencing something I had said later, or earlier, and that is that we're talking about Chomsky, and we're talking about anarchism, libertarian socialism, and I said that Chomsky is a liberal. And people got justifiably defensive about that. People who respect Chomsky's views, people who find liberal to be an epithet and not a descriptor, people who, feel a lot of value in the anarchist tradition, which is totally understandable. And now, I thought about it a little more, and I realized that I misspoke. That I think the basic principle I was arguing is correct, but I did not elaborate clearly enough on why. So my basic argument there was, so some leftists like Mehdi Hasan and are dragging out, as Democrats do every 4 years, the increasingly aged Noam Chomsky. They wind him up like a fucking Teddy Ruxpin, and they ask him, should you vote for the Democrat? And he says yes. And then people like Mehdi Hasan say, see, Chomsky says vote for Biden. You're not to the left of Chomsky, so that means the left position is to vote for Biden. And now, Mehdi Hasan, I think, probably has bad faith in that. But I don't think that Chomsky has bad faith. I think a lot of, you see people talk about how when this comes up, they'll say, oh, he was at MIT all those years and defense contracts. And, the bulk of his work and the bulk of his work on life belies that being real. He clearly says what he believes. He has paid the price for saying what he believes his whole life. And the way I know that he bears a price is because he answers every email he receives, which means he is clearly, at some level, seeking truth. No one would do that if they weren't. So I believe Chomsky when he says that his reason gets him to voting for Biden. This is where liberalism comes in. Because I think, and you can listen to me and tell me if I'm wrong or not, I think that that Chomsky's liberalism is why I think he's wrong, first of all, about voting for Biden. And I think his liberalism, not just to say he's wrong in isolation, but you've only ever explained something if you've explained why. A lot of shit that happens on the internet is people describing a condition and then calling that an argument. You haven't made an argument until you've added the why. So I will make the proposition that, first of all, we'll take the as assumed proposition among us that, yeah, you don't have to vote for Biden. That's silly. You don't agree with him. Now let's figure out why we disagree with him on this. And this is, once again, how I have reasoned it out. You can tell me how you think I'm wrong if you do. And the reason I made that people said Noam Chomsky's a liberal and that came up is because they had an intuitive understanding that was tied to his wrongness in this case. And a lot of people took that the wrong way, and they're like, oh, do you mean it like he's too stupid, or he doesn't get it, or he's too... Because when you say someone's a liberal, you mean there's some combination of stupid and greedy. There's some combination of too dumb to get the point, or materially positioned where they don't want socialism. So they're either dumb or greedy if they're liberal. Like, that's what liberal is. It's some combination of those two things. And the thing is, we all are to some extent. And how much we are depends on our fixed position in space-time and the life we've lived. So when I say that Chomsky is a liberal, guess what? Karl Marx was also a liberal to different extents. Now, to the extent that Chomsky is a liberal is the extent that he has explicitly said that his vision of the world, his vision of politics, his vision of practice, all comes from Enlightenment thinking. He has said that a million times. He even points to a specific, relatively obscure German humanist as like his foundational influence. I'm going to find the guy's name. I keep forgetting it. Chomsky, Enlightenment, some Kraut influence. One of my people. One square-headed motherfucker. God damn it. Now I feel like I'm losing you guys because I can't find the name of this dude. It's some dumb name. Anyway, I will find it at some point. In the meantime, what matters is that he fixes himself in the liberal tradition of personhood. So when he says, I want to do X, Y, and Z because of the liberal tradition, what he means is he believes in socialism as a moral proposition flowing from the inviolability of the individual. That's where the liberalism comes in. He believes that the individual is an unmoved place of meaning, an essence, that a soul exists. It's not necessarily spiritual, but there is a individual human consciousness that is unmoved and that moves upon others. That's the liberal conception of the self. It arose as the economy in Western Europe became more complicated, became more abstracted, and required a greater degree of abstracted thinking in order to process it. And that created a more abstract notion of the self than the more immediate notion of the Renaissance era, or certainly the medieval era, where everyone believes in God. So that version of the self that emerges to compensate for this new, more complicated, this new, more complex economic arrangement and social system that you're in, makes you into that liberal subject. So he carries that with him, and he said that. And so that means that he's approaching, so that's why he is a liberal when he approaches the question of should you vote for Biden. Now, Marx also as a liberal subject because he was born in the early 1800s in southwestern Germany, a region that was one of the areas near the Ruhr Valley that was one of the original hotbeds of industrial capitalism. Now, industrial capitalism was still in its infancy, but he saw it, and his life took place in tandem with the arriving of industrial capitalism. Witnessing that in his life and witnessing its impression on the world around him made him think differently. And it made him take the dialectical processes that he noticed lead through economic development. Like, what powered us from slave states to feudalism to capitalism? It was a dialectical conflict of forces within the society. Slave, freeman, serf, master, serf, lord, worker, owner. That is how society comes into recognition of itself as a society, is through conflict within it. He applied that, as Hegel did, to the self. Now, they say that they do it on different sides, but it comes back to the same thing. The self is a series of resolved contradictions. It is not an individual monad that moves of its own volition. It is always being made by what's around it. And that means that when we examine a political question, we have to examine it in time and space. So that is why Chomsky looks at the question of vote for Biden two-dimensionally. Here's the Democratic Party, here's the Republican Party. The Democratic Party is less evil. It's less bad. its platform is not as bad. The people who make it up are better people in the sense that they have more agreed upon stated values that accord with what we think is the good. So, shit, what was I saying? So anyway, so that's the Democrats are on that axis better than Republicans, and so Chomsky says, I want what's best for everybody. The Democrats want more of what's best for people than the Republicans do, therefore I have to vote for Democrats. And the thing is, that's correct. He reasoned that out right. He's right, but only on that mere level. He has not interposed the context on top of it. And the context that Chomsky misses, because he's not applying dialectical reasoning to the question, is the role that the Democratic Party plays in making the Republican Party worse over time. They drive each other. The degree to which the presently construed Democratic Party is allowed to maintain its structure, the people in charge of it, and its material base, as in who contributes money to maintaining it, that will continue to, as it has, drive the Republicans bad, to the right, even more reactionary. So their rule is even worse. And that means that when they take power, they only intensify a process that's going to happen either way. Like, take, for example, if Biden is president during a world-defining economic collapse following, because, like, okay, say we get the virus under control, when we let back up, there is no return to normal. There's a huge demand gap that will have to be filled. And filling it will be a bigger challenge than the Great Depression. If the Democrats are in charge of that process, the way the Republicans were during the early days of the Depression, they will be the party associated with austerity, because they will be doing the bidding of actual capital. And in a situation like that, austerity is demanded. So they will be that reactionary party, which means that the Republicans, they're not going to get less racist. They're going to get maybe a little less racist. They're going to get more redistributive, and maybe it'll be enough to get them into power. At which point you have like a few mild social democratic trappings to a system that is mostly dedicated to like an ethno state. You flipped it over. You could have had the other thing. So whatever that is, that dimension is absent from Chomsky's analysis of the situation, and so it's wrong. And the reason he gets it wrong is because he comes from a liberal conception of the self. He thinks that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are distinct things that move of their own volition, based on what the people within them want. That's not the case. They are brought into being in conflict with one another, always, at the personal and system and intellectual level. So that is why Chomsky is wrong. And it comes from him being a liberal. Like I said, Marx was also, here's the kicker. Marx also, growing up in the early 1800s, had a liberal conception of the self that he interposed on top of dialectical materialism. So he accepts personhood to the level that Chomsky does, of all humans are worthy of respect, that the golden rule applies to all recognizable humans, depending on how we define that. But then he puts dialectical materialism on top of it. Chomsky doesn't. And so that can run off in all kinds of wrong directions when it comes in contact with a place that has evolved beyond the conditions that produced to the original insight. All right, that made sense. I felt better about that one. I gotta say, like, this is why the key to all of, like, thought and right action and all those notions that I never really understood from Buddhism and Christianity and Islam and from socialism is practice, the need to do them every moment. And so, like, I felt kind of crippled by how people were going to think I was crazy when I started explaining things a few of the episodes ago. Now, by repetition and keep doing it, and from hearing back from people who've heard me, I have more confidence. That fear is gone. So I'm able more to concentrate on getting across the ideas, and I'm better able to get the ideas across. I am able to concentrate more perfectly because I'm less worried about appearing crazy, because I got feedback in the form of you guys talking to me saying I wasn't. That's it. That is in capsule how you learn and think and become a human being. It is a process. And that is what the liberal conception of the self cannot absorb. And that is why anarchism, even if it has the right goals, will go about achieving them less efficiently. Like, it could still get there over enough space and time, but compared to other approaches, given the limits of our lives and the limits of matter in the universe, there are more effective ways to go about it. So once again, I am asking for all feedback. And basically, the way I approach all this stuff is, if you say something, what I realized is that when I was a takesmith, when my job was just piping off takes, the way that I would, if I got to a level of understanding of an issue that I did not fully grasp, I would have an emotional response. Usually it would be some sort of panic and shame that I didn't know. That panic and shame would have to be transformed into overcompensation elsewhere, in the form of dropping a big name of somebody whose book I probably hadn't read, saying something loud and obnoxious, or performing my anger, because that distracted from the fact that I had hit bottom on a point, and that left me rootless. I don't know where to go if I don't know why I think what I think. And dialectical reasoning, which is something I had seen written about and talked about, never understood. Now, thanks to absolute luck, I'm in a position where I can explain it to myself enough to convince myself to do it. And that makes me better at it. It's literally growth. And it comes, and the thing is, it happens no matter what. But if we recognize the process, if we recognize that it is through resolution of conflicts, then we recognize the need for action at all times, the need for acting and then people say, yes, but what about the crippling postmodern condition, the crippling quotation marks on everything, that endless recursion to self-consciousness? Well, once again, if you add another dimension, if you add time to the dimension, that problem goes away. So I believe simultaneously, this is a little up there and I won't go too far to try people out, but I simultaneously, in equal measure, believe that all actions, up to including my decision to lift up this spindrift grapefruit sparkling water and taking a sip from it, are fully and completely physically determined. I had no say in the matter, if viewed from outside the process. If viewed from God's eye, if viewed outside of space-time, it's billiards. It's direct causality. There's nowhere you can get down to a level and find something that wasn't caused directly by something else. But there comes an inflection point. If you are aware enough of time, and time as it occupies the space that you occupy, you can recognize your position. You can recognize the determined position of everyone else. You can understand why everything is the way it is, why you are where you are, why the person you're talking to is in their position to you, why they're mad at you, why they're happy to see you, why anything, why that garbage truck is barreling towards you, why anything, why there's a recession, why the TV show isn't good anymore, why. You have a fucking answer. And if you have an answer, you can act from full confidence. And that means it doesn't matter that technically your actions were determined. In the moment, you see every option, and you have the confidence to do the leap of faith that Kierkegaard speaks of. The leap of faith comes from having confidence in your decision. The decision gets confidence from your degree of perception. That when you are making a decision to do something, you are confident that you are perceiving correctly. And if you're only perceiving space, or only in a little bit of time, you will be racked with doubt, and it will paralyze you. But if you have enough consciousness of time as a dimension on top of space, then you can act with full free will. And the thing is that you always are acting on free will. It's just at a different level. Like when you jack off instead of cleaning your room, you're acting of free will. What it boils down to is you want to jack off to distract yourself from the fact that you are not doing a thing that is in accord with what will get you to a consciousness and a sensation of time. And you don't want to clean your room because it's boring. And it's boring because all physical activity involves, some degree of mental output. The more mental output it takes up, the less space is left for the questions. That's where ennui comes from. That's where existential angst comes from. It's from the degree to which you're not directly engaged, which is why people seek things like drugs, sex, jacking off, war. They're seeking the heightening seeking the heightening of symbolic reality beyond words. That's what they're looking for. And so, if you're going to clean your room, the only way that's going to get you to not feel that way is to literally keep thinking while you're picking things up. Keep thinking about picking things up. Thinking about what's going on around you. How long is that going to take? It's going to suck. The amount of present potential pleasure that you have to give up to keep doing that, eventually, if you don't believe in it, if you don't believe in doing it to get there, you're going to try something else, like jacking off. So there is no such thing as a contradiction, and no such thing as a hypocrisy. Everything you do or don't do, it's because of what you truly believe. And becoming conscious of time, aka mindful, aka in the moment, aka dialectical, is the degree to which you can actually put faith behind action. All right, that's what I got. I don't know if it made sense. I don't know if if there's problems with me. As I'm talking though, like now a little bit of the worry is coming back, but it's after, not during, which makes me feel better about it. You guys want to hear me talk a little bit about fascism? Because I realize I've talked a lot on just shows, and I've thought a lot over the years about fascism, and I realized I was missing some significant parts about it. Significantly, the question that is really powerful and really on people's minds now, because we see how insufficient our institutions are to dealing with the current crisis. What if fascism comes back? What's going to bring fascism back? And that has led to further splits down at different levels of meaning, different levels of semantic translation, that have resulted in now there's a big fight on the left about, is fascism a real threat? The fash. Is there a Chapo to fash pipeline? Do we have to worry about fash in the streets? Should we be doxing Pepes because if we don't, they're going to march like the SA through Nuremberg? And I think that there's been a lot of heat expended on this topic. I know that I've generally been skeptical of the looming threat of fascism, but I haven't been able to express it. And I feel like now I'm a little closer to understanding it. And so I want to just get it out there and see if you guys make sense of it. So my main objection to people wanting to label things in the current moment as fascism is my knowledge of how historically fixed fascism was, in terms of it's impossible to imagine fascism outside of the post-World War I context in Europe. Like, the cultural ingredients were very specific. But also you want to have a word for, nationalist authoritarianism when it shows up. But once again, that was because I wasn't thinking dialectically. I was thinking only along the planes of binaries, and not the nesting binaries. So now what I've realized, and you guys can tell me if I'm wrong, is that the root of my objection there, that fascism has like a fixed interwar context, really does lead you to a further insight that tells you really what the threat is in the moment, in my opinion. So, first of all, we have to understand what fascism is. Now, it's one thing to say fascism is capitalism in crisis. That's true. The thing is, it's capitalism in a specific type of crisis. It is in a crisis of, it is in a material crisis. It is in a crisis where you have the built-up industrial capacity, but you don't have the inputs. There is a demand shortfall, otherwise known as a depression. Now, capitalism was relatively new in the 20s. Modern democracy was even newer. So in the cauldron of these things came this thing that solved a lot of questions about mass politics and about crisis of capitalism, but in the wrong way. They solved a lot of the problems of maintaining a system, but at the expense of, the soul of the people living under it. So if we think of there being two types of inputs into capitalism or any economic system, if we think of them as human labor, obnoxiously put by, and more generally, biopower, the term that Foucault invented to refer to just human inputs into human systems, like intellectual and literal sinews. So biopower and technology. That is the balance in all economic orders that have risen to this complexity of having tools. So this was a bio crisis. This is not a crisis of technology. It was a crisis of inputs. And fascism's specific solution to a crisis of inputs in capitalism is to solve that by grabbing inputs from outside. First, by building up military forces that had to be used, because military resources are the kind of things that if they're not used, they literally take up space and undermine your ability to maintain economic regularity, but then use that military to literally take from outside. It's like capitalism's dying. It's a fish on the beach flopping, and its last attempts to get some oxygen came in the form of bursting outward to grab and hold. And of course, because that is going to bring counter responses in the form of everyone else banding together against you, you're probably going to die. But you wouldn't necessarily. I think that Philip K. Dick made a very good point in his observation of the plot of The Man in the High Castle. So even if the Nazis and the Japanese had won World War II and become the new Cold War, their fascist regimes were structured for that environment. They were structured for the frantic grab for resources in the scarcity moment of a significant capitalist crisis in capitalism. They're not built for plenty. They're not built for growth. And so, for no reason at all, they're going to end up nuking each other, because fascism is not built for those conditions. But the impulse to solve, all right, so now we're going to have another crisis, like the Great Depression. The impulse within capitalism to solve that problem through hyper-exploitation of biopower, basically, that's what I meant by expanding outward. Using the hyper-exploiting biopower to build up the capacity to literally enslave the forces of others in the form of the Slavs, who were to be literally turned into a slave race. So that problem in capitalism still exists of how to solve the biopower technology issue. Now, there is a potential technology solution to that, which is, we get free energy, or 3D printing, or whatever people were talking about in Wired magazine 5 years ago. But if that doesn't happen, and it doesn't look like it is, because honestly, a lot of these currents end up looking like scams to get VC money retroactively. So the problem is still there. There's still a technological barrier. So if we're going to keep capitalism, basically, and we can't solve the problem technologically, which was true in Europe after World War I, they had an economic crisis that could not be solved technologically. They had to enslave and exploit biopower. The other solution to that would have been to communalize, to share to share more evenly the surplus and reduce the pain and the accompanying social crisis caused by the pain from hyperexploitation. Now, some countries did that to some different degrees. Like dumbass Jonah Goldberg says that the New Deal is Nazism because it had public works. No, the New Deal had the same features, some of the same features as Nazism to socialize surplus productively. Nazism did socialize surplus productively, but that's not all it didn't do. That's not all it did. It also built up this military state that had to be used. If the degree to which you draw surplus down and use that to alleviate disruption and pain caused by crisis is the degree to which capitalism has been tamed, basically, the way FDR tamed it in the United States. That's one way to go. And you could go farther. Like, if things had gone differently, if the Tai Ching sticks had fallen differently, we would have built socialism in America, or something much closer to it, out of the New Deal. Things intervened later to stop that from happening. But we were on a trajectory, thanks to a general tendency in America, because of its specific outlay, to move things in that direction. Germany, because of its specific outlay of material conditions, went towards solving it with hyper-exploitation and destruction of biopower. We are in the same boat now. We're going to be anyway. I mean, we're already there. A lot of us are already there, and more of us are going to be in the boat as things continue to get bad. And we're going to have the same crisis of capitalism. There's going to be the same technological limit on increasing surplus. That way, that means there's going to have to be hyper-exploitation of biopower, which, of course, is why one of the things I had pointed out earlier about fascism in a different episode, in the inebriated past, was that one feature of fascism is that it brings colonial practices into the metropole. Now, if we see colonialism as capitalism reaching out in the death throes of its productive state within a country to gain more raw resources and markets to sustain itself, and then you have a crisis of capitalism in which, because first, that there's a weird dynamic with empires where at first they're enriched, and then over time, as the networks solidify, the extent of empire actually becomes a burden on the middle state, but it's okay because it can be afforded. Eventually, there's a crisis. Those beams start cracking, and all of a sudden, the biopower you need to hyper-exploit isn't on the periphery anymore. It's in your home country, and you have these tools you've used on those natives to use on your people. So, what you're seeing is the response to a input crisis by hyper-exploitation and destruction of biopower. And that is a possibility now. But here's the thing, and here's why I hesitate to use the word fascism to describe what I think is the danger. They're still going to hit a technological limit on how much they can increase surplus or whatever, absent exploitation and hyper-exploitation and destruction of biopower. But that level is way higher than it was in the 20s. Way higher. So we have much more technological, so there's much more technological undergirding of society and our political order. Now what that means is there's much less of a biopower aspect of political power. Back in the 20s, political power meant bodies in the streets. Over time, as capitalism got more complicated, and as the middle class grew, and as symbolic language got more complicated, language fled to the actual boardrooms of, the executive suites of power only, and then it was just a symbol for people to respond to because they no longer had their hands on the real wheels of power anymore. Now we have such a technologically advanced society, and the biomechanism of politics is so impoverished that if they decided that they needed to execute the fascist playbook in terms of hyper-exploitation to resuscitate surpluses, they don't need the mass movement that Nazism represented. They don't need people in the streets. They don't need brown shirts or Proud Boys. They have invested enough power in alienated machine tools, surveillance, CCTV, computers, GPS, drones, whatever. The degree to which that has accumulated to capital and to the capitalist state since the 20s, the degree to which that has accumulated is the degree to which the need to have a mass right-wing movement of any kind falls away. Because you don't need them. You don't need the bodies. You don't need the beef boys in the streets with guns. You don't need Gavin McGinnis. You have the state arrayed with a technological advantage over regular people that is undefeatable. You don't need to further bolster authority with popular legitimacy, because that's what fascism was. It was an attempt to give capitalism the popular legitimacy necessary for it to continue. Now, in order for those people to believe in capitalism, they needed to give them scapegoats for why things weren't getting better enough. And that's the engine that leads to the Holocaust. They didn't need to do it, but they felt they did because they convinced themselves it was necessary, because it was an underlying fundamental lie that they told to keep capitalism going. Because there was such a huge role of people in creating state power. State power, I mean, my God, the German state almost got overthrown like 3 times in the 20s by Spartacists or whatever, botched general strikes. That was an environment in which popular legitimacy needed to adhere to any regime that was going to continue to exist. It would be ripped up otherwise. And fascism was a way to do that. I don't think that need in the system exists anymore. I think it is a byproduct of the system, and you see deformed, smaller versions of it, but because we have such an impoverished political bioterrain, they're not relevant to the struggle, because they're not at the point of force. The point of force is in a fucking in a trailer, an air-conditioned trailer in Nevada with a joystick. He's in a gamer's chair. He's got like fucking candy necklace around himself. He's Twitch streaming, and he's annihilating a fucking wedding in Yemen. He could just as easily be annihilating a militia gathering in Montana. And if things go in one way, he will be. But it will not require a mass political movement to do it. It will require new ideologies, but they will have to apply to fewer and fewer people, because they'll need fewer and fewer people to push the buttons. And the people who aren't pushing the buttons can literally, at that point of crisis, be exterminated. He's dabbing on us, folks. Booyah! Booyah! And what we call right-wing populism is a vestige and an echo of that, but in a new context in which the political realm is deeply technologized and dehumanized. It all takes place on screens. Politics takes place on screens, and then what? Rallies, which are literally like going to a concert. You know? It's like watching TV and then going to the movies. That constitutes, like the act of watching TV and going to the movies, the actual act of it, sitting in a chair, looking at a screen in your house, going outside, sitting in a chair, and looking at something else, or going to the theater or whatever, those 2 acts constitute the sum total of most people, including me, political activity. That is different than when you had thousands of people in streets punching each other and fighting, and occupying factories and doing direct conflict with the state over its resources distribution. And in that situation, you don't really, not only do you not need men in the streets, you couldn't get them if you wanted to. Like those guys, the brown shirts were willing to die, and they did die in large numbers. The Horst Wessel Light, which was the song, which was the theme song of the Sturmarbeitlung, the brown shirts, was about a martyred young SA officer who was killed by a communist, even though in reality it was like some sort of fight over a sex worker, and he was a pimp. But like that was part of it. It was like living or dying were part of it. Now it's a cathartic theater. All those jackass, like everyone's shitting their pants about those absolute lumps hanging around the Michigan courthouse. They're allowed to do that because they're not a threat to any power structure. And see, that's different in other countries. Like, I would be much more comfortable saying that whatever is going on in India shares those features because the technological balance is so much different. Because there's so many people, for one thing. I've read Fascism. I like Paxton's book on fascism a lot because it contextualizes it in like actions as opposed to ideology. Because honestly, I feel like anybody who wants to talk about fascism and their sources are like thinkers, even if it's guys like Evola or Meniscus Moldbug or any of these guys, you're missing the point. Because fascism was a praxis. It was a attempt to channel popular support and popular mobilization away from socialism down the easier road of a co-opted populism. Because the Nazis had a much easier road to take power than the communists did, even though they had similarly huge followings, similarly mobilized street bands. It was because the state wasn't stepping on the necks of the Nazis. So it's a cynical recognition that you can skip the steps. Like Mussolini looks and sees, hey, I can use this rhetoric and these ideas to get people in the streets to give me power. And I don't have to worry about the landlord hiring some mob dude to blow my brains out with a shotgun sometime when I'm taking a shit. I don't have to worry about the fucking getting arrested. Because the people in power need me to channel some of that away and to redirect it in a fight to suppress it. It's a purely cynical move. The person who makes that move and that decision has no values. So anybody who made the pivot to because you can talk all you want about socialists inspired Nazism or fascism, but at that moment of choice, like I said, those guys were destined to be Nazis by their conditions. If you look through it, every decision was predetermined. But in the moment they chose to be a Nazi, in the moment they chose to say, you know what, this whole working class thing is too tough, there's too many obstacles, I could use some of these other elements and some of these other critiques without getting the state down my back. Now, that should tell me something. The fact that the state doesn't want to stop me, should tell me that they're not interested in ending the exploitation that is the cause of all of this. If they were, they wouldn't let me take power. So I should think about that. And if you don't, if you ignore that because you're too greedy or you're too dumb, then you're not a socialist anymore. You've gone off on another tangent. You're in another. You've stepped off into another parallel dimension. Bye bye. Because that's a moral choice. It's a moral choice and an intellectual choice. It's a test, and you failed it both ways. Because look at the fascists. That was not a stable basis for a society. You fucked up. Like, sorry, the German state, the German people could not do what you thought they could do, Adolf. Objectively, you were wrong. Like, Adolf is one of the few gods who can know definitively that he lost. Like, Hitler basically knows more than any other one of the few human beings on Earth who knows what Satan felt like in Paradise Lost, because he was God. He was remaking the world with his voice, basically, on a principle that he believed as deeply as I believe in mine. But the thing is, that outcome was determined in the real. Because he couldn't wait. He needed to have it now, which means he needed to see it happen in front of him, which means that he took a bunch of shortcuts that got him fucked over. And so even by his own rule, even by his own law, he was found wanting. Like in the bunker when the Soviets were invading, he famously was like, fuck the Germans, they failed me. But then of course he also failed them, and he knew that. As he blew his brains out, he knew that. So no one went to hell harder than no one was cast into hell with greater fucking alacrity than Adolf Hitler. Yes, of course. Yes, become a communist and start organizing essential workers. I agree with that. The problem is I don't have sufficient confidence in a specific set of actions that will get me there yet. And that's the thing. One of the things that defeats growth is that you label yourself as having certain capacities and then you just never try again. If you don't judge yourself and say, I have insufficiency to this task now, I might not later, you'll find that you can do things a lot easier. I love. Oh, someone asked about Wilhelm Reich. I only know about the orgone box, and I love the concept of orgone. I think it's a very good metaphysical, visualization of a real phenomenon. Excuse me. Well, all right. Somebody says, are office workers management or labor? They are, like most things, a degree. They are to a degree workers, and they're to a degree management, and their relationship to management and labor is contingent on the specific moment you're talking about. So that's as much detail as I can get into. And that's one of the reasons it's hard to talk anywhere, let alone online, is because you end up making shortcuts linguistically and symbolically that reduce the actual content of what you're trying to get across. And then people don't fully get what you're trying to say. So like if I tried to get more specific there, I would start using words wrong because I don't have the granular knowledge of the situation down to the level of like almost pure visual symbol. So no, see, that's the thing. Dualism is a trap if you think that there is only dualism. The binaries are a trap if you think there are only binaries. But there are. The universe is made up of binaries. Binary opposites trying to occupy the same space at the same time and being cast out by that action. But there are so many of them happening at so many different levels that also everything is purely relative to other things. Everything is purely relative. But also, everything is objectively one way or the other. But not at the same time until you notice. Not at the same time until you open Schrodinger's box. And then they collapse into one moment where certain positions obtain, where there is a binary being discussed, where you are not you're talking about a degree. That's why I think the fast pipeline stuff is very funny, because I am foundationally opposed. Like I can tell you, I think I can tell you, I feel more confident. I guess I'll say it this way. I gotta maintain, an even keel. I feel more confident. I feel that I could more confidently describe why Nazis are wrong than the people who put most effort into defeating them online. And the reason for that is the reason that they fight so hard against Nazis online is because they know they're bad, and they're right that they're bad, but they're not fully aware of why they're bad. They only know some of the reasons. And instead of pursuing them further for other specific reasons and specific influences, they flee from the question. And that is why they have to no platform, and that's why they have to abolish the idea of anyone else, not create categories of unthinkable thought, because that's the only way that they can deal with the unresolved trauma of not having thought through what they believe, because they're right that Nazis are categorically bad, but they got to that reasoning insufficiently. And so that leaves them with a lot of excess emotional energy around the name and the word and the idea of Nazis that they unproductively direct emotionally instead of where it would be more productively placed. All right, guys, this has been pretty fun. I will be back on Twitch tomorrow. And yeah, there's not the 1 hour time limit on Twitch like there is on Instagram, so I think that'll be a fun one. Probably going to go a little long. I might do some more graphs. We'll see how I'm feeling. But talk to you guys tomorrow. Trying to keep these around 6 o'clock, unless things are intervening with the FYM boys or I have something else to do. But I will try to do one every day. This is part of my daily practice. So if you're gonna still be here, I will still be talking. And like I said, please give me back any questions you have, because that's the only way I'm gonna keep on the path of the beam here. Bye-bye.